Hi, we're continuing in 1 Corinthians 15 through the resurrection chapter of the Bible, or better said, the bodily resurrection chapter of the Bible, as Paul is answering some important questions. The questions we see are in verse 35 of 1 Corinthians 15. I'll read it for you here. But someone will say, how are the dead raised? He's going to answer that in verse 50 and following. We're going to get to that in a few posts. But right now he's answering the question then with what kind of body do they come? Hey, that's a good question. What are our bodies going to look like? What are we going to be like when we're resurrected? Going to look exactly the same, close, recognizable? Well, he's going to give us 4 specific principles over the next number of verses through verse 49. 4 principles. I'll give them to you right now, and you can jot them down. And in each of the upcoming posts, we're going to talk about those 4. Number 1, our body's going to have continuity. We're going to talk about that today. Secondly, our body's going to have distinction. Oh, I like that one. And thirdly, our body's going to have transformation. What's that mean? And fourthly, it's going to have identity. These are the primary principles that Paul's going to teach us about our resurrection body and answering the question given in verse 35. With what kind of body do they come? So let's get to the first one, continuity. We see that in 3 verses. We see it in verses 36, 37, and 38. So let me read them for us, and you can read along in your Bible if you have it there. It says, you fool, that which you sow, talking about a seed, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And that which you sow, you do not sow the body which is to be, but a bare grain, perhaps of wheat or of something else, Paul says. And then in verse 38 he says, but God gives it a body just as he wished, and to each of the seeds a body of its own. So he uses a horticultural example to help us understand what our bodies will be like. Just as a seed of wheat, and that's the example he uses, or any seed he could have chosen, a seed of wheat goes into the ground. Number 1, it has to die first. Do you remember what Jesus said when he was in John chapter 12, verse 24? He said, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Now, that's the horticultural truth. But he was speaking, of course, of his own body that would have to go into the ground and die, and much fruit would be born because of that resurrection. Now, does the seed really die? Well, science would tell us not really. It still stays alive. It still keeps going, but it doesn't come back the same. That's Jesus' primary point. It comes back looking different, but with, and here's our word, continuity. It looks similar. You put wheat into the ground, it comes back wheat, not corn. You put corn into the ground, it comes back corn, not peas. You put Craig into the ground, it comes back Craig, not Bill or Sue or John or a dog. There's going to be continuity of myself, just as there was continuity of Jesus' body. You put Jesus into the grave, and he died literally, completely, physically, and he came back looking like Jesus. He was recognizable to the disciples. Well, not at first. He looked a little different. He looked a little better. He looked a little bright, and he could walk through walls, apparently. And he was different, but he was recognizable. Do you remember the Cleopas and his friend on the road to Emmaus? Finally, whoa, they recognized him as Jesus. They had been with him, but they didn't recognize him at first. And I imagine that you and I, when we get to heaven, hey, you look a lot better than I remember you. Maybe we'll be younger, maybe we'll be thinner, maybe we'll be better looking, maybe, I don't know. I'm just conjecturing there. But the point is, we're going to come back as our own self. We're going to be recognizable. You're going to recognize your loved ones. They'll probably look better. They'll probably look sweeter and more perfect than they ever did before, but they'll be recognizable as you will be. So there'll be continuity. Not the same. We're not coming back exactly the same as you are, and I'm so glad about that, aren't you? We're going to come back with continuity. Just as a seed that falls into the ground comes back with the continuity of still having the essence of that grain that was put into the ground, so we will have the essence of who we are. God's not going to take all the atoms that are dispersed and totally changed in the ground and put them all back together and make us look the same. Aren't you glad? But he's going to take the DNA, the essence of who we are, personality-wise, person-wise, and he's going to put us back together in a continuity. I'm so glad for that. That's the resurrection of Jesus, and that's what the resurrection of Jesus means for you and me and what our bodies will look like. Come back for the second one. See you soon.